Hi there. In part 1 we set up this Harrison 140 lathe to cut 2 TPI, which it doesn't do as standard. And in part 2 we're going to cut a 2 TPI 2-start thread on this piece of Delrin. And then I want to do a bit of a deep dive into the threading dial on this Harrison 140 lathe and figure out just how useful or not is this threading dial. In other news, I've still got this darn cold, which has really set me back quite a bit, but I'm getting my voice back now. I've made a good start on the balancing ring for my surface grinder wheel, so there'll be a video on that later. And also, yesterday, I had a really good time. I went to the Harrogate Everything Electric show, Harrogate in England, and it was all about home automation, green energy, EVs, really interesting stuff. So I'll tag a bit of that on the end, just photos, no hype, no music, whatever, just some photos. And I'll maybe describe it too. So if you want that, just stay on to the end. Well, I've found a way to do it, but it's been a bit tricky. It's been one of those things you think you understand how it'll work, and it's not quite how it seems. Let me explain. Next morning, brain refreshed, and I've just been watching Stuart de Harrow's video on multi-start threading, and I'll put a link in the description, and he explains 3 ways to do it. And the way that I did it last evening to do those scratch passes on a 2-start thread was one of the methods that he mentioned. Now, you may not be able to see this if you're looking at this on a phone, but that's the exploded diagram of the geared head on this lathe. And the thing to note is down here we've got a couple of gears which basically form the drive between the spindle and the change gear train that goes down to the screw cutting gearbox. So that one's an idle gear, and that is the gear that engages or disengages if you engage or disengage the drive. Now let me flip this over and I'll show you in more detail, and even on a phone you should be able to see it. So the way that I indexed 180 degrees to cut that second interleaving thread was to turn this shaft here, which disengages the power feed drive, by moving that gear over to the left and disengaging it from this idler gear, which is driven by the spindle. And I was able to do that for a 2-start thread because this gear has 42 teeth, which is divisible by 2. It's also divisible by 3. So by using this method, which is turn the knob, rotate the chuck by 180 degrees in this case, and re-engage that gear, I was able to do it. If it had been a 4-start thread, I wouldn't have been able to do it that way. So just to recap, looking from this end of the lathe then, if we're cutting 2 or 3-start threads, we can cut the first thread, disengage the drive to these gears, rotate the spindle 180 or 120 degrees, re-engage that gear, and off we go. But if we're cutting 4 starts, that's not going to work because 42 is not divisible by 4. Well, unlucky. Another way to do it is to slip the banjo down, rotate this 90 degrees for 4-start, but it's not going to work because that's a 50-tooth gear and we can't index by 12.5 teeth. So I started to look at this entire gear train. Remember, first driver, first driven, times second driver over second driven. And I can't find any integer number of teeth on any of these which would align for a 90-degree turn on the chuck so that we could just drop the gears back on and in place. So that method isn't going to work, so we need to look at the other method, which in some ways is easier anyway, and that is to put the feed onto the top slide. Speaking as somebody doing this for the very first time, I feel as if the gear slip method would be the most accurate. But if I was trying to cut a 4-start thread, that wouldn't work, as we said, so I could do it by advancing the top slide. So there and there I've got my 2 TPI. To drop in the second start, I'd have to advance the top slide by 1/4 of an inch, or 6.35 millimeters on this lathe because it's metric. But I'd have to make sure that I'd got the backlash out on this top slide right at the beginning. If we were cutting metric multi-start threads, we might be able to use this threading dial. Now I've noticed this is marked 30, 60, 90, 120, whereas the imperial dials I've seen tend to be marked 1, 2, 3, 4. So I wondered what was all this about, and I've worked it out. So the lead screw here is 6 millimeter pitch, and every small division here is 6 millimeters of carriage travel. So that's 120 millimeters of carriage travel. And notice on this, between here and here, we've got 5 divisions. So we don't have any half division like I've seen before on imperial dials. Here's the plate on the end of the saddle which tells me how to use the dial for different metric thread pitches. And I now realise this top set here, which says you can engage at any mark, they're all factors of 6. And if you read the others, they all make sense. But what they don't tell me is how to use the dial for multi-start threads. So it'll be a bit of fun to try and work out, how to use that dial for multi-start, but I'm going to put that to the end of the video. I'll do a spreadsheet tonight maybe. Let's get back to this thread we're trying to cut. To keep it simple, I'm just going to cut a square thread. So 2 TPI, that one, and the interleaving thread, that one and that one. Well, if I remember correctly, that gives us a lead of 2 and a TPI of 4. So the lead is how much the screw advances in one turn. So it advances ½ an inch, which is a lead of 2, but the number of teeth is 4. And the width of each thread tooth is 1/8 of an inch. So I'll just grind up a bit of high-speed steel to cut 1/8 of an inch. But we've got to think about the clearance that we need on the side of the tool, because look at this angle here, the slope. And the slope changes according to the diameter of the work, that distance in other words, and the speed of the thread. The tool is ground to 1/8 of an inch wide, plenty of rake on the top and the sides. Sorry, this is handheld. I'm using the other end of the bar. I've put a large relief in just there, and then the bar is clamped with some carbide paper underneath the jaws, just to make sure that the workpiece doesn't slip round, because that Delrin's quite slippery. But before we start cutting that thread, just a cautionary tale. There's no safety clutch on the lead screw, and when I was trying to get this all lined up, I still had the half nuts engaged, and I was backing this off, this carriage, and I just heard the gears strain a bit, and that edge there, look, was just coming up against that, and I saw it displace slightly. Quickly hand on the clutch, but in some circumstances I'm sure that could break something. Now this should cut 0.1 of a millimeter. Or maybe a fraction less actually. Well, here's another cautionary tale. I've only cut down to 0.4 millimeters, but I started to see the angle of the thread against the angle of this rake here, and it didn't look as if this rake was enough, and when I measure it, it's only 10 degrees. And I worked out it had to be at least 13, so I need to grind a bit off this. So this is a 0.1 millimeter cut down to 2 millimeter thread depth on the first thread. You're down the end of the lathe because I have to give myself the benefit of the best view. First thread completed, and when I check it, as good as my eyes can see. It's dead on pitch. Well, before I slip the gear to put in that interleaving thread, I'm going to make a cardboard pointer for the end of the spindle. Now with 2 starts, it's probably not really necessary. 42 teeth on that driving gear, it's about 8.6 degrees per tooth. So if we were out, we'd probably spot it. But we could be cutting any number of leads which are divisible into 42. So it could be 3, could be 6, could be 7. And I think with 7 starts, if you wanted to do one, you'd need some kind of pointer. So I think it's worth it. We'll just try it for the practice. I'm still sorting through that stuff that Brad sent me. These are BSF taps mostly. Got some duplicates. The dial gauge stem is just acting as a pointer. I want a couple of other checks just in case the cardboard slips. Now as it's turned out, jaw 1 has landed just about horizontal. So that can be the first extra check. And the second one is, I've brought the tool onto the work and I can see that the tool is lining up with the thread. So then as I turn this, it should be quite easy to see if I've got it right and the tool's in between the 2 thread grooves. So disengage the power feed, put the lathe into neutral gear, check the cardboard, turn, hope it doesn't catch on anything, and that should be it. Now at this point I should be able to put this back in gear like that, and that back in gear like that. Check the jaw, looks right. Check the position of the cutting tool, looks right. I'll do a couple of extra checks off camera. Now this method, by disengaging the drive, putting the lathe into neutral, is only possible because I think the main reduction gear for low speed is 120 teeth, and that's divisible by 2. It's divisible by 3 and by 6, but not by 7. The 42 tooth gear would allow indexing of 7 starts, but not this main drive gear. So whether I could pull the lathe over by maybe just releasing the main clutch or something, I don't know. This is a 0.1mm cut down to a depth of 1mm. Two millimeter thread depth. Cut to 3.1 mil. Reverse, tool out, return, repeat one more time. 3.2, last cut. Scratch it off. Concentrate, concentrate, last cut, stop. Stop machine. Phew. Looks good, doesn't it? Don't bail yet because there's a few things to discuss. I did that spreadsheet last night. metric threads with the metric threading dial. You might be surprised by some of the results. Just before we talk about metric, I'll just say a few words about imperial. I got this chart from Kim Bazelic. It's a chart instruction for multi-start threading. If you want a copy, just email him. But first off, you can see the threading dial here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the intermediate A, B, C, D. And the instructions here say which divisions to use to do multi-start, 2 starts, 4 starts, and so on, for the different thread pitches. You might not be able to read it, but it says here even threads cannot be indexed. So it's a pretty complicated picture, but the point is, look, you've got these quarter points and then you've got these intermediates here, like, you know, northeast, northwest, southwest, however you say it. But you don't have those on the metric dial. Not mine anyway. And this is just a reminder of my dial. So you can see the quarter points here, but then there's 5 divisions between each quarter. There isn't a northeast, southeast marker. Now you might be able to line up on these marks if you're eagle-eyed, but they're not so easy to line up on, are they? So I would argue that there's actually only 4 useful positions on this dial. Here's a picture of the plate on the end of my saddle, and you can see 0.5, 0.75, 1 millimeter pitch, which you can engage on any line on the indicator. Well, that means you don't need the indicator. You just pull up the handle and it'll just drop in on the first position that the lead screw lines up on, and these pitches will sync up. You've got these, which is any numbered line, so that's the 4 positions, which includes 10 millimeter, which this lathe as standard doesn't even cut. 4 millimeter, 2 positions on the dial, and then all the rest it says you can't disengage the half nut. Well, that's not true actually, now I've done the work on it, because this is not a complete set at all of the pitches that you can engage on any line. This is the spreadsheet I did last night. Now if you're looking at this on a phone you won't be able to read it, but just focus on the colours and I'll talk you through it. This column has all the standard pitches that the lathe will cut, including 8, 10, 12 and 15, which I've got because I've now got the 70-tooth gear. And across the top we've got divisions on that dial. So starting from 1st division to the 20th division, and every division is 1 turn of the lead screw, which is 6 millimeters. So 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, and these pink coloured cells are the 4 quarter positions on that dial. And all I've done is divided this number, that's the thread pitch, into 6 millimeters, and anywhere that it ends up with an integer value we can engage the half nuts. And the point of the green stripe going all the way across, that's telling us that we can engage the half nuts at any position on that dial. And there's quite a few here that were not on that plate on the end of the saddle, so 0.2, 0.25, 0.3 and so on, 0.4, 0.6 and so on. So I found some pitches which are not on that plate, and it told you that you couldn't use the dial for those. That's the implication, but it isn't true. It just was incomplete information. Now we start to look at some pitches where you can engage on the quarters. Well, there's a 0.625 pitch. I don't know whether that's a standard pitch or not, but it's listed. And that green square, that green square, that green square, that tells us we can engage on the quarters and it will be in sync. What have we got? This one, 0.8 pitch. So we can do that at 60 and 120. And so on, we work our way through. There's one pitch, I think it's 0.9, you can engage it on 90, that one, but that's the only one. So I take the implication that you can engage that and sync the thread up every 3/4 of a turn, which would be difficult to track, wouldn't it? But it does seem possible. Now, you won't be able to do multi-start threading on any of these where you can drop the half nuts in it on any mark. There's no space to do that. multi-start. But if you've got any which will only engage on 2 of them, then I can't see one offhand. Yeah, that one there, look. So 4. So you can engage here and here. Well, that says 15, that says 7.5, and that says 22.5. So you would be able to engage the half nuts on 30 and 90 for a 2-start thread. But my overall conclusion is the dial isn't half as useful as it is on an imperial lathe. I don't know whether all metric dials are like that, and perhaps not, but it was a very useful exercise to do this. I will just zoom in so those of you with phones will get a bit more idea what I'm talking about. So just to recap, these are the threads, these are turns of the lead screw, which is the same as marks on the dial. This is the 5th mark, which is marked as 30, and all of these pitches here, it's green right across, so you can engage on any mark and sync up the cut on the thread. As we come down to point 625, that funny thread, you can engage on the quarters, but there are some where you can engage on different positions if you could follow what was going on. So 0.35mm pitch, look across, we've got an integer there at 7 turns. Now if you think you can track 7 turns, every 7 turns around that dial with 20 marks on it, good luck to you, but it could be done. Well, that's another topic where I thought I understood it until I really got into it, but I've learnt a lot, and maybe if you want to find gears to give you extra pitches on your lathe, what I've done might help you a bit. If I had to cut 2-start, 3-start or 6-start, I think I would use the gear method. I'm confident with it, on that lathe anyway, and then if I was cutting 4-start, I'd have to use the method of moving across the top slide. Bit of a surprise to find out that the threading dial on my lathe isn't really that useful. Not as useful as those on an imperial.
Quite a big show, indoor and outdoor. Indoor, there were lots of little mini cars, there were home energy system suppliers, and there were also energy retail suppliers. A lot of these funky little trucks and vans, all electric. I like the look of that one, probably wouldn't buy it myself. This is the Octopus stand, there was an OVO energy stand, so they're retailers. Ford were there with a large stand. Mercedes, Volkswagen, ID Buzz in the people carrier format, then in the van format. Quite a big presence from Hyundai, while I think of it, Volvo were there as well. Cougar were there. This is from Spain. Got a plug-in battery, you can wheel it into your house to charge it. It will also power this little scooter, same battery. Chinese were there in force, so BYD, MG in bright colours. These used to be made in the UK until 2016 on the Longbridge site, but then now it's all made in China. This is coming soon, this yellow car. This caught my eye, this Aura, very smart styling, and we actually took that for a test drive. So that's it. Just a very quick look at it. Thanks for watching.